Well, good morning, Crosspoint. I'm so excited to be with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt. Man, if you guys are applauding for my name, just wait for my jokes, because it's going to be great. No, but I'm Matt. My name is Matt, and I'm the campus pastor of our Ventura location, and I'm just so thrilled to be with you guys. And I love this concept of thinking about who we're going to be in 5 years. I mean, because really, it's something that's inevitable. You will be somebody or something in 5 years. And the question is, who is it? Who are you going to be? And you get to decide what that is. And one of the things I think that happens, at least if you're like me, is that sometimes it feels so far off that it's like, yeah, I know it's coming, but it's like what I'm going to be like in 30 years or 40 years. And it just seems so foreign that we don't really put too much time or attention into thinking through how I can shape the next 5 years. But here's a little exercise I want to do with all of us before we jump into the Bible this morning. I want you to pull out your notes, all right? So pull out your program. If you're somebody that just wants to indulge me and you're on Instagram right now, just pretend like you're texting these things in, I guess. You can do that. But I want you to just write down your age 5 years ago. So in January of 2015, how old were you? All right, just write that number down on that piece of paper, because I just want you to think about how short of time 5 years can actually be. Now, here's what I did. I actually have a picture of, this is me and my wife 5 years ago, okay? And I know we're just going to address a couple of the things immediately. You have two thoughts. The first is this: is he aware of the attractiveness gap between he and his wife? Yes, totally aware. I get it. I look up there and I say, yeah, I don't understand it either, but she said yes. So here we are. The second thing you're probably thinking is, man, Matt is a lot like a fine wine, isn't he? He's just getting better with age, okay? Also guilty. So those are a couple of the thoughts that you undoubtedly have. But here's one of the reasons why I want to put this up on the screen. Is because I look at this picture and I think about that season of life I was in. But what I also start to do is I start to contrast all of the massive changes that have happened in my life in the last 5 years. I mean, in the last 5 years, my wife and I, we've moved 3 times. We actually bought a house here in Orange County. We sold it. We bought another house in Ventura. We were able to actually have a foster child. We also had a child of our own, and then we had a second child. In fact, this is a picture of my family now. We live in Ventura. This is my beautiful family. So this is Elizabeth is in my arms. She's 1 year old. This is Catherine in my wife's arms. And the funny thing is, when I think back to January 2015, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago. But then when I really stop and process all of the incredible and massive changes that have happened in my life in just 5 years' time, I kind of am forced to ask myself the question, who am I going to be in the next 5 years? So here's the next thing I want you to do. On your notes, I just want you to write down what your age is going to be 5 years from now. And this is solely just for your own personal benefit and good, that you can actually look down and see, who am I going to be in 5 years' time? How old will I be? Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, I want to tell you a story. And here's how this story is going to start off, is the kingdom is ecstatic. In fact, everything is going great. Now, in the country of Israel, they had a season of just prosperity and goodness. That their king had been so incredibly gifted in areas of leadership and in military prowess. Their borders had expanded. Their banks were full. Everybody had food on their table, and it was a good time to be an Israelite. But this was a really special time, because one of those incredible stories had just leaked from the capital. See, something awful had happened. One of the king's top warriors, one of his inner circle, one of the good guys, a member of their own SEAL Team 6, had gone into battle and he had died. And the word had crept back into the capital that his wife had just recently found out she was pregnant. And so here you have this hero of Israel. He is now dead. His wife is now going to be a widow, and now his child is going to be an orphan. But the king, oh my goodness, the benevolent and good king has actually said, I will take care of you. He actually marries this widow, brings her into his palace, and says, Whoever this child is, whether it's a little girl or whether it's a little boy, I am going to raise this child as if it's my own. And everybody in the country is celebrating this. They're thinking, wow, like, this is our king. Our king just doesn't let people suffer in their misfortune. He brings them into his family, and he makes them one of their own, and it's a time of celebration. The king is married, a child is on the way, everything is great. And then this prophet walks into the royal court. And as Nathan starts making his way to the front, the king, David, sees his friend and says, Nathan, how are we today? Nathan says, I have a problem that I think I need your wisdom on. See, here's the story. There's two men. One is incredibly wealthy, and he owns countless flocks of sheep. He's got servants galore. I mean, he is just a man of means, and everybody knows him, and everybody loves him. But then next door to him lives this poor man who has but one little lamb. And man, this man, he loved this little lamb. In fact, he would bring it into the family. He would feed him from his own table. He would feed this little sheep. Every night they would cuddle up together. It was his prized possession and the thing he loved most in the world. But then one day, the rich man who lives next door is having a dinner party, and he decides, we need to have a great feast. And rather than going out into his own flocks and picking his own sheep, he goes next door, and he takes the prized little lamb from this poor man, he slaughters it, he cooks it, and he puts it on his table to feed everybody else. Now, as Nathan tells the story in the royal court, the blood pressure starts to rise. You can feel the tension in the room. Everybody is just bothered by the grave injustice that has just been described. In fact, so much so, the king, David, actually stands up and he says, whoever this man is, he deserves to die. And then this, the entire mood, the tenor, the feeling in the room completely changes. Because Nathan, the prophet, he looks at the king, and with this incredible fear and frustration and sadness, maybe a hit of anger, he looks at David the king and he says, you are that man. And so what happens is word gets out. David didn't benevolently bring in this widow who's carrying another man's baby. See, word starts to get out that while the warrior Uriah is off in battle, David calls his wife to the palace. He sleeps with her. She gets pregnant. David finds out. And he sends Uriah to the very front line to make sure that he will not make it back alive, all covering his steps, and then spins this tale that I'm a good person. I'm bringing in this poor widow and her unborn child into my home, and tries to sell it like he's the good guy in all of this. The you that you're going to be in 5 years is going to be built over time, but more than likely is going to be defined by a moment. Some of you right now, you have a pattern in your life. You're walking down this path where you've got great ideas and plans for what your future can be, but your drinking is just getting out of control. And it's going to build over time, but that's not what's going to define you. The moment that's going to define you is when you run that red light and you take a life in the process. See, right now you have some patterns in your life where your inattention to your spouse, it's building and it's growing, but that's not what's going to define you. What's going to define you is when you're actually sitting across the table with your lawyers on either side and you are signing those divorce papers. Some of you have a pattern in your life of reckless spending, but that's not what's going to define you. It's going to be the moment that you actually declare for bankruptcy protection. Some of you have a pattern where there's that person at work and you just seem to keep flirting and you think it's innocuous and nobody's really going to be bothered by this and it's not really leading anywhere, but it's not what's going to define you. What's going to define you is when you have to sit down and have that really awkward conversation with your wife, or maybe even the more painful conversation when you have to explain to your kids why you cheated on their mom. And so here's what happens. We all know people where these types of stories have happened. And more often than not, here is the typical pattern that we see. If you're on the outside, you hear that, you're shocked, and you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this would happen. But here's something I always know is true. Those who are on the inside, like those who are part of the inner circle, they say, no, I think that makes sense. See, here's the thing. No matter how great our dreams can be over the next 5 years, they can be derailed by a moment. And more often than not, it's not always a surprise to us, is it? Several years back, I was living in this apartment where I had this light fixture that had like the 3 bulbs inside and it had this large like 12-pound glass globe that would cover up the lights and kind of diffuse it around the room. And one day, one of the light bulbs go out, and so I decide like I'm going to take it upon myself to change it. So I take it down, I start putting the light bulbs in, and I start to put the globe back over the lights when, and it's one of those like 3-pin things where it's all on like different sides. And so as I start to put the pins in, I realize I only have 2 in my hand. And the third one is still down on the table, and I have this fateful thought like cross my mind. I bet 2 pins will hold this globe for a second. Well, I reach in and I grab the third one. And I got to tell you, I was right. It held for exactly 1 second. Because as I'm reaching down to grab the third pin, I feel like this large crash on my head. And then this giant shard of glass just like hits my hand, falls onto the ground. And it was one of those things where the impact happened, and I immediately knew blood is about to be everywhere. And so I was right, like blood just starts like flowing all over the place. And so I grab a friend, I'm like, I need you to take me to the hospital. And we get in the car and we start driving. And here's just a little bit of information. Like this was early on in my adult life. And I was actually still on my parents' insurance. And there was 2 hospitals to choose from. And frankly, I could not remember which one was in my parents' network. But no matter which one it was, I chose the wrong one. That's what happened. So I get to the ER. They take me out of the ER. They take me for x-rays. They do the stitches, the anesthetics, the whole 9 yards. And I get home. They patch me up. I'm fine. And then a couple weeks later, I start getting bills in the mail for like several $100s. And at this point in my life, I'm only making like $300 a week. So, an $800 bill for my stitches, like that's not an easy thing to swing at that point for me. And so I would see these bills, I would smile at them, and I would set them aside. Then I'd get another one. I'd look at it and go, I'll set it aside. I'll deal with this later. And then they just keep coming. And what are they going to do? Like turn my stitches off? Like it's not like the electric bill. And so I just kept moving them aside. And here's the thing. I after a while, I just started to pretend like the bills didn't exist. That wasn't until like my dad called me and he's like, Matt, I have creditors calling me now. You have to deal with this. And the thing is like, I realized that was an attitude I'd taken towards something that was very uncomfortable and something I didn't really want to deal with and something I knew was going to take a little bit of work to actually pay off. But I realized I do this all the time for myself. There's things I pretend not to know. And so let me ask this question to all of you. As you think about the patterns that are developing in your life, what are you pretending not to know? What is true, you kind of bury down and say, I'll deal with that later. That's something that can wait for tomorrow. What are you pretending not to know? See, there's this progression that we all know is true when it comes to destructive behaviors. In fact, Jesus' brother, a guy named James, he actually writes this in James chapter 1, and he's writing to the first century Israelites when he says this about just temptation and destructive tendencies. He says this in James 1, 14-15. He says, temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us, and they drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. Now, here's the deal. It's not temptation unless you actually want to do it, all right? We just need to make sure we state that right now. So we're not talking about the temptation to, perform Grand Theft Auto. I know maybe some of you, that's your thing, but for several others, you're like, you don't walk by like a nice car and think, man, I wish I could break into this and steal it right now, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the things that you actually deal with, the things that are actually tempting to you. So what happens is temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and it drags us away. But then there's a progressive nature to it, isn't there? See, what happens is we have the thought come into our head. We dwell on it. We think about it. We start fantasizing about ways that we could actually fulfill this hunger and this craving. And then what we do is we allow that temptation to give birth to an actual sinful action. Now, the first time you do it, it might be something small that nobody would ever notice. But our destructive tendencies, our sin, has this way of multiplying whenever it stays in the dark. So what happens is over time, that sin, it's allowed to grow. And you allow it to progress and get a little bit larger and a little bit more destructive until eventually it gives birth to death. And I don't want you to get too stuck on that word death right there because, maybe some of you have memories of those drug talks that you got when you were in junior high where it's like everybody who smokes marijuana one time ends up in a car accident and is completely dead. And, all your friends are smoking and you're thinking well, that's not actually true. And we write that off that's not a real thing. Here is what I'm talking about. That pattern that's built over time, that is defined by a moment, creates a spiritual death inside of us, doesn't it? It creates an emotional death. It's that awkward conversation. Yeah, and there's further ramifications in the long term, but I just want you to think short term. Death will come when we allow our sin to grow over time. Imagine a lot like this. It's a hook in the water. It's got the bait on it. You want to take a bite. When you finally do, it starts to pull you, and it's too late to let go. What are you pretending not to know about you? Okay, let's go back to the story of David for a second. Let's talk a little bit about how his life could get so radically turned upside down by this moment that was allowed to define him. It actually says this in 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. It says, in the spring of that year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Reba. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Okay, there's a lot of discussion about how to interpret this verse. Some people take this and they say, oh, it's very clear, there's a commentary that David should have been out in battle. He shouldn't have been in Jerusalem. He should have been there. That might be true. In fact, it's likely that that is the case. But here's the thing I really want you to hear right now. Every strong male personality is outside of the city, except one man. And in a highly patriarchal society, where the king has all this authority, there's no other person of a strong personality or any ability at all to question anything that David is about to do. He is by himself. And then we get in verse 2, it says this, late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. Now there's a couple ways to read this one as well. See, sometimes we read this and we think Dave's just trotting along, then all of a sudden, boom, he's got those cartoon eyes shooting out of his head auga, there's this beautiful woman. Where did she come from? This is amazing. And I love how the Bible describes her of unusual beauty, all right? She is so attractive, she could be a part-time model, okay? And not one of those Instagram thirst account types. I'm talking about this woman is hot, all right? She could be in a JCPenney ad. That's just how beautiful she is. But here's the problem. Is once you understand a little bit more about the dynamics of what Jerusalem and what David's life and what society was like in that day and age, you have to read the accident part out of this. See, here's what I know and what I've been taught about Jerusalem in that day and age. Jerusalem was a city that was built on hills. And, just like even today, like where it makes a lot of sense and there's a lot of prestige and power to live in the hills. That's why some of you, when you write your address, you don't say Anaheim, you say Anaheim Hills, because like that, there's like some prestige and power. It's like not Catella, Anaheim. I'm talking about Anaheim Hills, all right? Like that's where I live. And so, like even to this day, like there's prestige and power like to living on top of the hill. And that day and age, it was no different. So Jerusalem is a city that's built on these hills, and the palace where the king lives is at the very top of it. So he can have a view over everybody in his city. Here's something else I know. It's a city that is in the Middle East. It gets very hot. And so most of the structures do not have like the arched roofs. They have flat roofs. So that as it gets really hot inside, you could go and spend time in the cool of the outdoors, especially in the evenings. Now, another bit of information that you might need to know is that women would bathe about the same time every day, late in the afternoon. So when you start piecing all these things together, here's what you learn. There are no strong male personalities in the city with the exception of one. It's that time of the day where women go out and take their baths. David has a viewpoint over every rooftop in the entire city. It is that time. David is channel surfing through the premium channels, like at 1 a.m., okay? He's on Instagram, and like he's gone to certain hashtags, and he's just kind of like flipping through. Temptation is the hook. We choose to bite. I don't think David was up there and going, oh my gosh, I can't believe at bath time, as I can look out over the city, I see a woman bathing. I don't think there's any accident here. There's a pattern developing in his life. And what happens is it becomes too much for him. So he calls a servant and he's like, who is that woman? They go and they find out. It's Uriah's wife. Man, Uriah's a warrior. That means he's not in town. Call her up to the palace. And what happens is like some commentaries and things that you read, they'll say, you know what? Bathsheba, like she has to have like some ownership in this, all right? Like, she had to have known that the king would be looking out there. Some people would even say that based on some other parts of her story, she was a very ambitious woman, so maybe she was like baiting David, hoping that she could be part of the kingdom. If that's true, okay, whatever, but here's what I want to say. David is 100% responsible for this. Okay, David calls her. He is 100% in the wrong. And there's like a further complication to the story. Remember, this is the king. You don't say no to the king. This is an abuse of power. This is sexual assault. Like this is way, way bigger than just a guy who's like, oh my gosh, this woman is beautiful. I wonder if, I can get her number. Like this is so much bigger than that. And it starts with a pattern that if given the opportunity will grow over time. The you that you become in 5 years is going to be built over time, but more than likely will be defined by a moment. So I just want you to think about this. What is the pattern that is growing in your life? That thing that you are pretending not to know. What is that part of your personality? Or who is that person? Where is that place? That if you don't get this under control, and if you don't tackle it finally, and you don't actually bring it to somebody else and say, help me fix this. You don't take it to God and you say, God, I need some help. Will completely sink you and define your life. If you're looking for a way to avoid biting that hook, getting dragged further into it, and having just that awkward, terrible conversation, I'm going to give you this right here. Like, this could change your entire life. I want you to lean in on this. You know, you can remember it and write it down later if you're embarrassed, or write it down right now and, like, memorize this. Here is the first place to start if you want to avoid having one of those life-defining death conversations. Get off the balcony. Get off the balcony. You know the places you should not go. You know the people you should not flirt with. You know the things that you should not have in your house. Get them out. Get off the balcony. What are you pretending not to know? I love what one of the early church leaders, a guy named Paul, wrote. Because like this describes so much of just the human existence, but we pretend not to know this is true. It says this in Romans 13:14. It says, instead, clothe yourselves with the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ, and listen to this, and don't let yourself think about ways to indulge your evil desires. If you have like another translation, the one I grew up with said, don't make any provision for your flesh. Stop looking for ways to provide for your balcony moments, right? Isn't this what happens? Some of you are pretending not to know so that something is true in your life, and you keep providing for those patterns to persist, and they're going to eventually destroy your life. Where is your balcony? What are the things that you just need to get rid of? Stop hijacking God's plan for your life. He loves you enough that he's got something great in store for you. He has a vision and a plan of where he wants to take you. But so many of us, we look at the things that we want to do, and we make sure that we save a little bit of money aside for it. Or we save just a little bit of extra time aside for it. We make sure that it's easily accessible. We make sure that we still have their number saved in our phone. We make sure that we go first to their Instagram. We want to stay just in arm's length. Stop hijacking God's plan for your life. Sin destroys. And I think a lot of us recognize that, yes, it will destroy me. I get that. And some of you are like, I'm willing to make that bargain. Like, I'm willing to risk it. 50% chance it does, 50% chance it doesn't. I'm okay with those odds. But I want you to think about this. Sin doesn't just destroy you. It leaves a wake in its path. Sin destroys. It has collateral damage. You have to have those conversations with your family. You have to have those conversations with friends. You have to have those conversations with your boss. Get off the balcony. Get off the balcony. See, here's something that most of us don't want to admit is true, but it is. God is good when he lets your sin get exposed. See, here's the thing. Most of us, what we think is like, no, God's into damage control. Like, God doesn't want to ruin his reputation. No, God is not into damage control. You are into damage control. And that's why you pray that way. You pray that nobody finds out the things that you know are true about yourself that you're pretending not to know. See, God is not insecure. He's not concerned about his reputation getting messed up because some of your gunk splatters onto him when everybody finds out about that thing. And just so you know, too, God's also not waiting in the shadows, to bust out and catch you in the act. He's not a gotcha God. In fact, God has several plans in place to try and stop you before that. In fact, even in David's life, the plan A was not to send Nathan the prophet into the chamber to say, you are that man. In fact, in your life, God's plan A is probably not to send somebody into your life after you've messed up to tell you, look what you did. In fact, God's plan A, it might be me standing on the stage right now asking this question to you. What are you pretending not to know? And whatever that is, you got to deal with it. You got to get off that balcony. So if you want the epilogue to this story, there's some really sad parts to this. That child that Bathsheba, David's new wife is carrying, dies. In fact, over time, what happens is another of David's sons actually rapes his sister. And I believe that because David felt he no longer had any moral authority to speak into anything on this matter, he stays silent. Another one of his sons sees this and gets so upset that dad was silent and ineffective in this stages an almost successful coup. And I think the genesis of most of these problems stems all the way back to the night that David stood on the balcony, looking for an opportunity to provide for the things that he wanted to do that were going to destroy his life. When sin is allowed to grow, it can give birth to death. But I want to leave you with some good news as well. See, 1,000 years after David's life, God's own son would come to earth, and he would die to pay the price even for David and his mistake. And he paid the price for you and your mistakes. That the good news is this: if you don't make any changes in your life, you don't fix those patterns, you don't deal with it, you choose just to stay silent when you know that you should be doing something, that's not going to keep you from God. He's still going to love you. He still wants to have a relationship with you. But I hope that your desire for your relationship with God is greater than just yeah, we're cool. Like, I hope that you are somebody that says, God wants progress for my life. I ultimately want progress in my life. What are you pretending not to know? Be honest with yourself. Deal with it. Get off that balcony.